Once, there was a king and queen. They had 2 handsome sons and 1 little daughter. The daughter was so pretty that everyone loved her at first sight. When it was time for the little girl's christening, the queen invited all the fairies to come and celebrate. After the ceremony, the queen asked the fairies about the future of her daughter, Rosette. The fairies said they forgot their magic book at home and couldn't say anything right then. They promised to come back later to tell her. The queen felt uneasy about their response but insisted they share whatever they knew. After some persuasion, the fairies told the queen that Rosette might bring trouble to her brothers, even causing their deaths. They didn't have anything good to say about her future. This made the queen very sad. The king noticed the queen's sadness and asked her what was wrong. At first, she made up excuses, saying she burned her flax and lost her slipper. But the king knew she wasn't telling the truth. Finally, the queen confessed about the fairies' predictions regarding Rosette, and she worried about her son's safety. The king became sad too and suggested the only way to save their sons was by cutting off Rosette's head while she was still young. But the queen said she would rather lose her own head than agree to such a thing. She urged the king to find another solution. They thought and thought, but couldn't come up with anything. Then the queen heard about an old hermit who lived in a big forest near the castle. People went to him for advice. So she decided to visit him, hoping he might know how to prevent the misfortunes the fairies predicted. Early the next morning, the queen rode on a pretty white mule, with 2 of her ladies on beautiful horses behind her. They walked through the thick forest until they reached the hollow tree where the hermit lived. At first, he was annoyed to see them as he didn't like having ladies around. But when he realized the queen was there, he welcomed her and asked what she needed. The queen told him about the fairies' predictions for Rosette and asked for advice. The hermit said they should lock the princess in a tower and never let her out again. The queen thanked him and hurried back to the castle to tell the king. They wasted no time and built a tall tower where Rosette was confined. The king, queen, and her brothers visited her every day to keep her company. The older brother, known as the Great Prince, and the younger one, called the Little Prince, loved Rosette dearly. She was the sweetest and prettiest princess anyone had seen. A smile from her was worth more than 100 gold pieces. When Rosette turned 15, the Great Prince asked the king about her marriage, and the Little Prince asked the queen the same question. The king and queen found it amusing but didn't give a definite answer. Soon after, they both fell ill and passed away on the same day. Everyone mourned, especially Rosette, and bells rang throughout the kingdom. The dukes and councillors crowned the Great Prince as the new king, and there were celebrations everywhere. The new king and his brother decided it was time to free Rosette from the dull tower she was tired of. They only had to walk across the garden to reach the tower, which stood tall in a corner. Rosette was busy embroidering, but when she saw her brothers, she stood up, took the king's hand, and said, "Good morning, dear brother. Now that you are king, please take me out of this dull tower, for I am so tired of it." Then she started to cry, but the king kissed her and told her not to cry because they came to take her out of the tower and bring her to their beautiful castle. The prince showed her the candies he brought for her and said, "Hurry up, let's leave this ugly tower. The king will soon arrange a big wedding for you." When Rosette saw the beautiful garden full of fruit and flowers, green grass, and sparkling fountains, she was so amazed that she couldn't say a word. She looked around, gathered fruit and flowers, and her little green dog Frisk, with only one ear, danced before her, barking and spinning around in a charming way. Everyone was amused by Frisk's tricks. Suddenly, he ran into a small wood and the princess followed him. To her delight, she saw a peacock spreading its tail in the sunshine. Rosette thought it was the prettiest thing she had ever seen. She couldn't stop looking at it. When the king and the prince caught up with her, they asked what was so interesting. She showed them the peacock and asked what it was. They said it was a bird people sometimes ate. "What?" said the princess, "do they dare to kill such a beautiful creature and eat it? I declare that I will only marry the king of the peacocks. And when I am queen, I will make sure nobody eats any of my subjects." The king was surprised. "But, little sister," he said, "where will we find the king of the peacocks?" "Wherever you like, sire," she replied, "but I will only marry him." They took Rosette to the beautiful castle, and the peacock was brought with her to walk around the terrace outside her windows, so she could always see him. The ladies of the court came to see her and brought her lovely presents, dresses, ribbons, candies, diamonds, pearls, dolls, and embroidered slippers. Rosette said thank you, very nicely, and everyone was delighted with her. Meanwhile, the king and the prince thought about how they could find the king of the peacocks if such a person existed. First, they had a portrait of the princess made, so lifelike that you wouldn't be surprised if it spoke to you. Then they said to her, "Since you want to marry the king of the peacocks, we will go out into the world to find him. If we find him, we will be very happy. Meanwhile, take good care of our kingdom." Rosette thanked them for all the trouble they were taking for her and promised to take good care of the kingdom. She said she would only amuse herself by looking at the peacock and making Frisk dance while they were away. So they started their journey and asked everyone they met, "Do you know the king of the peacocks?" But everyone said, "No, no." They traveled so far that nobody had been farther, and finally, they arrived at the kingdom of the cockchafers. They had never seen so many cockchafers before, and the buzzing was so loud that the king was afraid he would become deaf. They asked the most important-looking cockchafer if he knew where they could find the king of the peacocks. "Sire," replied the cockchafer, "his kingdom is 30,000 leagues from here. You have traveled the longest way." "How do you know?" asked the king. "We know you well because we spend 2 or 3 months in your garden every year," said the cockchafer. Then the king and the prince became good friends with him. They walked arm in arm, had dinner together, and the cockchafer showed them all the interesting things in his strange country, where even the smallest green leaf costs a gold piece or more. Then they continued their journey, knowing the way this time, and they reached the right place quickly. They knew they had arrived when they saw peacocks in every tree, and their cries could be heard from far away. In the city, they found people dressed entirely in peacock feathers, which seemed to be the prettiest thing. They met the king driving a beautiful golden carriage, sparkling with diamonds, drawn by 12 peacocks at full speed. The king and the prince were happy to see that the king of the peacocks was very handsome. He had curly golden hair, was very pale, and wore a crown made of peacock feathers. When the king saw Rosette's brothers, he knew they were strangers. He stopped his carriage and asked them to speak to him. After greeting him, they said, "Sire, we have come from very far away to show you a beautiful portrait." So they showed the king the picture of Rosette. The king looked at it quietly for a long time, then he said, "I couldn't have believed there was such a beautiful princess in the world." "She's really 100 times prettier than that," said her brothers. "I think you're teasing me," replied the king of the peacocks. "Sire," said the prince, "my brother is a king like you. He's called the king, I'm called the prince, and that's the picture of our sister, Princess Rosette. We're here to ask if you'd like to marry her." She's as good as she's beautiful, and we'll give her a lot of gold pieces for her dowry." "Of course," replied the king. "I'll make her very happy. She can have whatever she wants, and I'll love her very much. But if she's not as pretty as you say, I'll have your heads cut off." "We agree," said the brothers together. "Okay, off to prison with you, and wait there until the princess arrives," said the king of the peacocks. The princes were so sure that Rosette was prettier than her picture that they went without complaining. They were treated kindly, and the king visited them often. Meanwhile, Rosette's portrait was taken to the palace, and the king couldn't stop looking at it. Since the king and the prince were in prison, they sent a letter to the princess, telling her to pack her things quickly and come to them because the king of the peacocks was ready to marry her. They didn't mention they were in prison to avoid worrying her. When Rosette got the letter, she was so happy that she told everyone the king of the peacocks was found, and she was going to marry him. There were celebrations with guns firing and fireworks. Everyone got cakes and sweets. For 3 days, anyone who visited the princess got bread and jam, a nightingale's egg, and some special drink. After entertaining her friends, she gave away her dolls and left her brother's kingdom in the care of wise old men, telling them to take care of everything until the king returned, especially her peacock. Then she set out, taking only her nurse, the nurse's daughter, and the little green dog Frisk. They sailed on a boat, carrying a bushel of gold pieces and enough dresses for the princess for 10 years if she wore 2 each day. They laughed and sang all the way. The nurse asked the boatman, "Can you take us to the kingdom of the peacocks?" He replied, "Oh no, not now." Then she insisted, "You must take us." He said, "Very soon, very soon." Again, she asked, "Will you take us?" The boatman finally agreed a yes, yes. Then the nurse whispered, "Do you want to become rich?" The boatman eagerly said, "Yes, I do." "I can help you get a bag of gold," she said. "Tell me how," the boatman exclaimed. The nurse explained, "Tonight, when the princess is asleep, you must help me throw her into the sea. Once she's drowned, I'll dress my daughter in her beautiful clothes. We'll take her to the king of the peacocks, who will be happy to marry her. As your reward, you'll get your boat filled with diamonds." The boatman was shocked by the idea. "But it's a shame to drown such a pretty princess." Finally, the nurse convinced the boatman to help her. One night, while the princess was fast asleep with Frisk curled up at her feet, the wicked nurse, with the help of the boatman and her daughter, picked up the princess, along with her feather bed, mattress, pillows, blankets, and all, and tossed her into the sea without waking her up. Luckily, the princess's bed was stuffed with phoenix feathers, which always float on water. So, Rosette floated around like she was in a boat. After a while, she felt cold and turned around, waking Frisk, who started barking. His barking woke up all the fish, who came swimming up and poking at the bed. Rosette thought the bed was rocking on the water and was glad she wasn't often this uncomfortable. The wicked nurse and the boatman heard Frisk barking and thought the princess and her dog were drinking sea water. They hurried to land, thinking they were close to the city of the king of the peacocks. The king sent 100 carriages to meet them, drawn by various animals like lions, bears, eagles, and peacocks. Rosette's carriage had 6 blue monkeys performing tricks. The nurse's daughter was dressed in Rosette's prettiest dress and covered in diamonds, but she was so ugly and ill-tempered that no amount of dressing up could make her look nice. She bossed everyone around and threatened to have their heads cut off. As the procession moved slowly, the peacocks perched on trees were supposed to salute the false princess, but instead, they cried out, "Go, how ugly she is!" This made her very angry, and she ordered the guards to kill all the peacocks who insulted her. But the peacocks just flew away laughing at her. The boatman, noticing everything, whispered to the nurse, "This is not good for us, dear friend, your daughter should have been prettier." But she hushed him, saying, "Be quiet, silly, or you'll ruin everything." They informed the king that the princess was approaching. He asked if she was prettier than her portrait. They replied that if she was even close, it would be fine. The king decided to go meet her, hearing the commotion. He thought the shouting was about some dwarf the princess brought with her, not realizing it was about the princess herself being called ugly. The portrait of Princess Rosette led the procession, followed by the king and his courtiers. When the king saw the nurse's daughter, he was furious and refused to go any further. He ordered her, the nurse, and those who brought her to be locked up in the tower. He also decided to have the heads of the two rascals, who were actually Rosette's brothers, cut off. Meanwhile, the king and the prince, expecting to greet their sister, were surprised when soldiers took them to a dark dungeon full of toads and bats, with water up to their necks. They feared they were going to be killed. 3 days later, the king of the peacocks came and scolded them through a hole in the wall. The king of the peacocks was very angry and threatened to cut off the heads of the king and the prince. The king defended himself, saying he was a good king with a splendid kingdom and lots of gold. He questioned if the peacock king thought they stole something from him. Initially surprised by this bold response, the king of the peacocks almost sent them away. But his prime minister advised punishing them to save face. They accused the brothers of being impostors, promising a beautiful princess who turned out to be an ugly girl. The brothers insisted their sister was a beautiful princess and needed 7 days to prove their innocence. Reluctantly, the Peacock King agreed. Meanwhile, the real princess and Frisk found themselves alone at sea with no boat. She cried, thinking the Peacock King abandoned her. They floated for 2 days, hungry and cold. At night, she asked Frisk to bark to scare away any danger. They drifted close to the shore where an old man lived. Hearing Frisk, he went to help and rescued the princess from the sea with a boat hook after several attempts. Rosette and Frisk were happy to be back on land. She thanked the old man and wore his wife's dress and shoes. Despite the simple attire, Rosette looked charming. The old man sensed she was important due to her satin and gold bedding. Rosette trusted him and shared her story, crying at the memory of being thrown overboard. The old man asked what to do next. He offered only black bread and radishes, which wouldn't suit a princess. He suggested telling the king of the peacocks about her presence, as he might want to marry her. But Rosette refused. She believed the king was wicked for trying to drown her. Instead, she asked for a basket. Tying it to Frisk's neck, she sent him to fetch the best food from the town. Frisk went to the king's kitchen, where the best dinner was being prepared. He cleverly took all the food and brought it to Rosette. Later, he returned for the best treats from the pantry. When the king wanted dinner, there was nothing left. He was angry and ordered a grand supper. In the evening, Rosette sent Frisk again to bring the best roasted food from the town's kitchens. Frisk took everything from the king's kitchen and returned for the sweets meant for the king's supper. The king, hungry and angry, found his dinners disappearing for 3 days straight. The prime minister, worried the king would starve, hid in the kitchen. He saw Frisk, the little green dog, take the food and tracked him to the old man's cottage. The king, astonished, went there with soldiers and caught them having dinner. The king ordered them bound, including Frisk. He planned to execute them along with the thieves stealing his food. The old man begged for time to explain. The king, seeing Rosette cry, listened. Learning her story, he embraced her and set them free. He brought her brothers and the traitors, who begged for mercy. The king and Rosette forgave them. The old man was rewarded, and the king of the peacocks apologized for the mistreatment. Rosette got back her dresses, jewels, and gold pieces. They had the wedding and everyone lived happily. Even Frisk enjoyed the best meals for the rest of his life.